This poor girl was being beaten with a belt by her father every day. She asks a millionaire for help. And when the millionaire sees her being beaten, he gets so furious that he does something unthinkable. Comment what you think will happen. Your opinion is very important, and subscribe to my channel to support my work. Your help is very important. The rain poured relentlessly over the quiet suburb of Pleasantville that March afternoon, turning the streets into miniature rivers. Richard Davenport was driving his imported car down Maple Street, trying to focus on the reduced visibility, when a scene through the blurred windshield made his heart stop. A little girl, no more than 6 years old, was cowering against a wall, her soaked clothes clinging to her fragile body. In front of her, a tall, gaunt man with a stubbled face and tattered clothes raised a leather belt in the air. The child's face was contorted in an expression of pure terror. Richard slammed on the brakes, his fingers gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. For a moment, it wasn't the little girl he saw there. It was another child, long ago, in terribly similar circumstances. Without a second thought, he parked the car haphazardly and jumped out into the rain. His Italian shoes sank into a puddle, but he barely noticed. The girl looked up at him, big, frightened eyes, but with a spark of intelligence that hit him like a punch to the gut. "Mister," she whispered, her voice almost lost in the sound of the rain, "my daddy beats me with a belt every day." The words pierced deep into his memory, awakening ghosts he had spent decades trying to bury. With trembling hands, Richard pulled his cell phone from his soaked suit jacket pocket and started filming. The man, realizing he was being recorded, immediately lowered the belt. His face went from red with anger to sickly pale in a matter of seconds. "What do you think you're doing?" the man snarled, taking a threatening step towards Richard. The question is, what do you think you're doing?" Richard replied, his voice icy cold, contrasting with the turmoil of emotions in his chest. "I've already called the police. I suggest you stay away from the girl." It was a lie. He hadn't called anyone yet, but the bluff worked. The man recoiled, stumbling over his own feet. The girl remained standing, shivering with cold and fear, her braids dripping water. Richard took off his jacket and covered her shoulders, noticing the bruises on her thin arms. "What's your name, sweetie?" "Jane," she replied, still trembling. Jane Carter. The name rang a bell in his memory. Carter. Where had he heard that last name before? A neighbor came to the door, drawn by the commotion. Soon, other people began to approach, forming a small protective circle around the girl. Her father, Walter Carter, as Richard would later discover, took advantage of the confusion to disappear into the rain. As he held the umbrella over Jane and waited for Child Protective Services to arrive, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that there was something familiar about the situation, something beyond the violence he had witnessed. The last name Carter kept echoing in his mind, connected to some memory he couldn't quite reach. Later, in his office at the development company he ran, Richard watched the rain from the panoramic window. His cell phone wouldn't stop vibrating. The video he had taken earlier had leaked and was spreading rapidly on social media. People were calling him a hero, an example to be followed, if only they knew. His hands trembled as he opened the bottom drawer of his desk, the one he always kept locked. Inside was an old photo, yellowed with age. In it, 2 children smiled at the camera, a boy of about 12 and a smaller girl with braids similar to Jane's. "Megan," he whispered to the photo, his eyes burning with contained tears. "Forgive me." The phone on his desk rang, startling him. It was his secretary. "Mr. Davenport, the social worker from the Carter case is on the line. She says she needs to speak with you urgently." Richard took a deep breath, putting the photo back in the drawer. As he prepared to answer the call, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being dragged back into a past he had worked so hard to forget. What he didn't know was that that rainy afternoon had been just the beginning. Jane Carter's story was about to intertwine with his in ways he could never have imagined, unearthing secrets kept for decades and opening wounds that had never really healed. Dr. Evelyn Davenport's office was located on the 10th floor of a commercial building in the most upscale area of the city. As she organized her notes at the end of that busy day, the renowned neurologist was surprised by the last person she expected to see, her ex-husband Richard, standing at the door with an expression she knew all too well. "We need to talk," he said bluntly. Evelyn adjusted her delicate framed glasses and indicated the chair in front of her. 15 years of marriage had taught her to recognize when Richard was truly disturbed. And now, looking at him, the impeccable suit contrasting with deep circles under his eyes and an almost imperceptible tremor in his hands, she knew something serious had happened. "It's about the video, isn't it?" she asked, although she already knew the answer. "Sarah showed it to me this morning." The mention of their daughter made Richard flinch slightly. "How is she?" "Anxious, more than usual. You know how she gets when something stirs up the whole school." Evelyn paused, studying her ex-husband with clinical eyes. "But you didn't come here to talk about Sarah." Richard got up, unable to stay still. He began to walk around the office, stopping occasionally to touch the medical books on the shelves, a nervous habit Evelyn recognized from their married days. "The girl, Jane. There's something about her, Evelyn. Something that reminds me of Megan," Evelyn completed softly. "I figured that's what it was." The name hung in the air between them, heavy as lead. Richard stopped walking, his back to his ex-wife, his shoulders tense. "I visited her family today," he continued, his voice low. "They live in a tiny house in the suburbs. The father, Walter, lost his job in construction 3 months ago. The mother abandoned the family 3 years ago." "Richard!" Evelyn's tone was a warning. "She's brilliant, Evelyn!" He turned around, his eyes shining with an intensity that frightened her. "The social worker let me talk to her while they were doing the evaluation. Jane has a natural talent for numbers that you had to see. Even without attending school regularly, she can do complex mental calculations. How can a child like that be trapped in that situation?" "And you decided you're going to save her?" Evelyn's voice had a challenging tone. "Like you couldn't save Megan?" The words hit Richard like a slap. He slumped heavily into the chair, running his hands over his tired face. "It's not that." "No?" Evelyn leaned forward. "Richard, I know you. I saw what the guilt over what happened to your sister did to you. I saw how it affected our marriage, how it affected your relationship with Sarah. I can't stand by and watch you self-destruct again." Before Richard could respond, a soft knock on the door interrupted the conversation. Evelyn's secretary poked her head into the office. "Dr. Davenport, sorry to interrupt, but your daughter is here. She says it's urgent." Sarah entered the office like a whirlwind, her dark hair disheveled and her school uniform rumpled. She stopped abruptly when she saw her father, her dark eyes widening behind her glasses. "Dad, what are you doing here?" The tension in the room increased exponentially. Sarah, at 15, was the spitting image of Evelyn in her teens. Except for her eyes, those were identical to Richard's, big and expressive. "I was just leaving, honey." Richard stood up, trying to smile. "Just came to talk to your mother about the girl from the video?" Sarah interrupted him, her voice trembling slightly. "Everyone at school is talking about it. Melissa Stone said she knows someone who knows her family, said the mother is an addict and abandoned the girl, and that the father—" "Sarah," Evelyn interrupted firmly, noticing how Richard had paled. "We shouldn't listen to gossip." "But it's true, isn't it?" Sarah insisted, her eyes fixed on her father. "I saw how you were after you made that video. It was like when you talk about Aunt Megan. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard seemed to have aged 10 years in a matter of seconds. "I need to go," he muttered, grabbing his coat. "I have an important meeting." "Dad, wait," Sarah called, but he was already heading out the door. Evelyn watched her daughter run to the window, watching her father cross the parking lot below. She knew that look well. It was the same one Sarah had as a child, every time Richard closed himself off, unable to cope with his own emotions. "Mom," Sarah turned, biting her lower lip, another nervous habit she had inherited from her father. "There's something I need to tell you about Jane Carter." Evelyn felt a shiver run down her spine. "What is it, honey?" "She's being transferred to St. Mark's School." Sarah hesitated. "To my class." St. Mark's School was one of the most expensive and exclusive schools in the city. Evelyn closed her eyes for a moment, feeling a headache coming on. "Let me guess, your father is paying the tuition." Sarah nodded. "And there's more. I heard he bought a house for her family in our neighborhood." At that moment, Evelyn knew that her worries were just beginning. She knew too well the demons that haunted her ex-husband and feared that his obsession with saving Jane could end up hurting not only himself, but everyone around him. What she didn't know was that, at that very moment, Richard was not in any meeting. He was standing in front of the humble Carter home, watching Jane through the window as she did her homework by the light of a dim lamp. In his mind, the image of the girl merged with memories of Megan, creating a web of guilt and redemption from which he could not, and perhaps did not want to, break free. And somewhere in the city, a woman named Tracy was preparing her return, unaware that her 3-year absence had triggered a series of events that would forever change the life of her daughter and everyone around her. In the small Carter living room, lit only by a yellowish lamp, Jane hunched over an advanced math book, a gift from Richard. Her eyes shone with fascination as her fingers ran across the pages, deciphering equations that children her age would normally not even dream of understanding. Walter watched his daughter from the kitchen, a cup of cold coffee forgotten between his calloused hands. The last few weeks had been a roller coaster of emotions. The humiliation of the viral video, the visits from Child Protective Services, the therapy sessions that Richard Davenport insisted on paying for. And now, the news of Jane's transfer to St. Mark's School. "It's getting late, sweetie," he called out, his voice hoarse. "You need to sleep." Jane looked up from the book, and for a moment Walter saw in them the same determined look as Tracy before everything fell apart, before the drugs, before the abandonment. "Just a little longer, Dad," she asked. "Mr. Davenport is bringing me more books tomorrow." The sound of that name made Walter's stomach clench. He should be grateful, he knew. Richard Davenport had not only prevented him from making the worst mistake of his life that rainy afternoon, he had also offered him a job at his development company, was paying for psychological treatment for both of them, and had now bought them a house in the upscale neighborhood of the city. But there was something in the way the businessman looked at Jane that bothered him deeply, as if she were a second chance, as if she were... The sound of screeching tires on the street interrupted his thoughts. Jane heard it too, lifting her head from the book. Footsteps approached the door, followed by urgent knocks. Walter felt his heart race. He knew that way of knocking. When he opened the door, it was as if the past had come back to haunt him. Tracy was standing in the doorway, thinner than he remembered, but with a different light in her eyes and in her arms. "Daddy?" A child's voice called from behind Tracy. A little boy, no more than 2 years old, was hiding in his mother's skirts. "Walt," Tracy began, her voice trembling, "this is Ben, our son." The world seemed to spin around Walter. Behind him, he heard the thud of Jane's book falling to the floor. "Mom?" The reunion between mother and daughter was like watching a car accident in slow motion. Jane remained paralyzed, her big eyes fixed on Tracy's figure, who took a hesitant step towards her. "My girl, how you've grown." "You left," Jane said, her voice small but firm, "for 3 years." Tracy swallowed hard, adjusting Ben in her arms. "I know, honey, but now I'm back, and clean. I went through treatment. I beat the addiction. I came to stay." It was at that moment that headlights illuminated the room through the window. A familiar car parked in front of the house, Richard Davenport's black Mercedes. Walter cursed under his breath. It was the last thing he needed right now. Richard entered the room, carrying more books, but stopped abruptly when he saw the scene. In front of him, his gaze went from Tracy to Ben, then to Jane, who remained motionless in the middle of the room. "What's going on here?" The tension in the room could be cut with a knife. Tracy stepped forward, extending her free hand. "You must be the man from the video. I'm Tracy, Jane's mother." Richard didn't shake her hand. His eyes, normally controlled, revealed a mixture of emotions that made Walter instinctively place himself between him and his family. "Interesting timing, Miss Tracy," Richard said coldly. "Just when your daughter is about to start at a new school, when your family is moving into a better house." "It's not like that at all," Tracy replied, a blush rising up her neck. "I didn't even know about these changes. I came because I'm finally ready. Clean. Cured." "Cured?" Richard gave a humorless laugh. "And what about the damage you've caused? How long until you relapse, until you abandon them again?" "Hey," Walter stepped forward. "Be careful what you say about my daughter's mother." "Mother?" Richard turned to him, his eyes flashing. "What kind of mother abandons a child with a violent father?" The silence that followed was deafening. Ben started to cry, frightened by the raised voices. "Please, stop!" Jane's voice, small but clear, made everyone turn to her. Silent tears streamed down her face. "Mr. Davenport, don't fight with my mommy. Mommy, don't leave again. Daddy." She hesitated, looking at Walter with pleading eyes. "Don't be mad." It was as if someone had burst a bubble of tension. Walter felt his shoulders slump. Tracy sobbed, squeezing Ben against her chest. And Richard looked as if he'd been slapped. "I'm sorry," he murmured, running his hands over his face. I need to go." He left the house hastily, leaving the books forgotten on the table. Through the window, they all saw him get into his car and rest his head on the steering wheel, his shoulders shaking. "He's not a bad person," Jane said softly, surprising her parents. "He's just hurting, like all of us." Tracy and Walter exchanged glances, recognizing in their daughter a wisdom beyond her years. Little Ben had stopped crying and was now looking curiously at the older sister he had just met. That night, while the family tried to rebuild bridges long burned, Richard drove aimlessly through the city. In his mind, the images mingled. Jane and Megan, Tracy and his own mother, little Ben and himself, as a child, trying to protect his sister from a violent father. His cell phone rang. It was Evelyn. "Sarah is having another anxiety attack," his ex-wife said without preamble. She found out about Jane's mother coming back. The gossip at school. Richard hung up the phone, unable to deal with yet another emotional burden. Without realizing it, he had driven to the old neighborhood where he had grown up. He stopped in front of his childhood home, now occupied by another family. It was then that he noticed a car parked across the street. Inside it, a woman was watching him, even from a distance, and in the dim light there was something familiar about her face. The cell phone in his pocket vibrated again. It was a message from an unknown number. "We need to talk about Megan." St. Mark's School exuded an aura of privilege with its imposing gates and perfectly manicured lawns. That morning, Sarah watched. From her classroom window, as a small figure in a new uniform and backpack timidly crossed the courtyard. It was Jane's first day. "Look who it is," Melissa Stone whispered to her friends, loud enough for Sarah to hear. "The charity case of the year has arrived." Sarah gripped her pencil so tightly that the lead broke. Her hands began to tremble. The first signs of an approaching anxiety attack. She took a deep breath as her therapist had taught her, trying to calm down. On the other side of the courtyard, Richard watched the scene from his car, parked discreetly. He had insisted on bringing Jane personally, despite Tracy's protests. Jane's mother's return had altered the dynamic he had so carefully built in recent weeks, and it made him deeply uneasy. His cell phone vibrated. It was another message from the unknown number. "I know what really happened that night, and I know you do too." His hands trembled as he read the words. Since the first message, 3 days ago, he couldn't sleep well. Who could know about Megan? Who was that woman watching him? A tap on the window startled him. It was Deborah Peterson, the social worker, her austere face contorted in disapproval. "Mr. Davenport, we need to talk." Reluctantly, Richard got out of the car. Deborah was a middle-aged woman with grey hair pulled back in a severe bun and piercing eyes that seemed to see through people. "Are you following me, Ms. Peterson?" "I'm doing my job," she replied dryly, "which includes ensuring that certain boundaries are not crossed." Inside the school, Jane entered her new classroom. The teacher introduced her to the class, and she walked hesitantly to the only empty desk, right next to Sarah. "Hi," Jane whispered as the teacher began the lesson. Sarah felt her heart race. She wanted to respond. She wanted to be kind, but the words were stuck in her throat. The familiar panic began to rise in her chest. "I know your dad is trying to help," Jane continued, her voice soft. "But sometimes helping hurts more than not doing anything." Sarah turned to her, surprised by the maturity of those words. In the parking lot, the conversation between Richard and Deborah was getting tense. "You bought them a house, enrolled the girl in this school, offered the father a job." "All in less than a month," Deborah listed. "Why?" "Because I can help," Richard replied defensively. "Because that girl deserves a chance. Like your sister deserved?" The words hit Richard like a slap. How do you know about Megan?" "I know more than you imagine, Mr. Davenport." Deborah took a step towards him. "For example, I know that you were the last person to see your sister alive." Richard felt the blood run cold in his veins. "Are you accusing me of something?" "Not yet. But I suggest you think carefully about your true motivations with the Carter family." Deborah adjusted her purse on her shoulder. "Oh, and Mr. Davenport, that night on Maple Street, was it really a coincidence that you were passing by?" Before Richard could answer, a commotion coming from the school caught both their attention. Students ran to the courtyard. Teachers shouted instructions. In the middle of the confusion, Richard distinguished his daughter Sarah being carried to the nurse's office. "Sarah!" He ran towards the school, momentarily forgetting Deborah and her veiled accusations. In the nurse's office, he found Sarah sitting on a cot, breathing into a paper bag. To his surprise, beside her was Jane, holding her hand and speaking softly. "Breathe slowly," the girl said, "like when we solve a difficult math problem, one step at a time." Sarah nodded, her breathing beginning to normalize. Richard stood at the door, watching the scene with a lump in his throat. "Dad?" Sarah saw him and immediately tried to compose herself. I tried to be strong." "You were strong," Jane stated, with a surprising conviction for someone so young. "Those girls were mean to you, but you didn't let them win." Richard frowned. "What girls?" "Melissa Stone and her friends," Jane explained. "They were saying bad things. About me, about you, about a person named Megan." Richard's blood ran cold again. How did those girls know about Megan? At that moment, His cell phone vibrated once more. The same unknown person. "Look out the window." Of the nurse's office. With his heart pounding, Richard approached the window. Across the street, standing under a tree, was the same car he had seen days ago. The woman was still there, but this time she had gotten out of the vehicle and was leaning against the hood. Even from a distance, even after so many years, Richard recognized that face. It was impossible, but it was her. The same person who had sent the messages. The same one who was now watching him with an unreadable expression. Deborah Peterson. His mind began to spin, connecting dots that had previously seemed scattered. The social worker's excessive interest, in his case, the questions about Megan, the disturbing familiarity he had felt when he first saw Jane. "Dad?" Sarah's voice brought him back to reality. "Are you okay?" No, nothing was okay. And as he watched Deborah get back into her car and drive away, Richard had the terrible certainty that the ghosts of his past were finally coming to collect their debts. What he didn't know was that at that very moment, Tracy was also receiving an unexpected visit at her new home, a visit that would bring to light even deeper secrets, connecting all the pieces of this puzzle in a way that no one could foresee. The Carters' new house was on a leafy street in Palm Gardens, a neighborhood that Tracy never imagined she could inhabit. As she arranged the small kitchen, still getting used to the new cabinets and shiny appliances, her thoughts wandered to the last 3 years. Rock bottom, the rehab clinic, Ben's birth, the daily struggle against addiction. The sound of the doorbell snapped her out of her reflections. Through the frosted glass of the door, she distinguished the silhouette of a woman. "Yes?" Tracy asked, opening the door partially. "Ms. Tracy Carter." The woman was elegant, with expensive glasses and a white coat. "I'm Dr. Evelyn Davenport. We need to talk." The last name made Tracy hesitate. "You're Richard Davenport's ex-wife, yes, and your daughter's doctor now, apparently." Evelyn adjusted her glasses. "May I come in?" In the modestly furnished living room, Ben was playing with some colorful blocks, oblivious to the tension that was settling in. Tracy pointed to the sofa for Evelyn and sat in the opposite armchair, her restless hands repeatedly smoothing her simple dress. "So," Evelyn began, her eyes scanning the room, "how's the adjustment to the new life going?" "Difficult," Tracy replied honestly. "Sometimes it feels like I'm living someone else's life. This house, Jane's new school, it's all so surreal." Evelyn completed. "Yes, my ex-husband has that effect on the lives he decides to transform." There was something in Evelyn's tone that made Tracy straighten up in the armchair. "Why are you here, Doctor?" "Because I know Richard better than anyone. Because I've seen this movie before." Evelyn took off her glasses, massaging the bridge of her nose. "And because I need you to understand what your family is getting into." At that moment, Ben knocked over his blocks, making noise. The boy began to cry, and Tracy got up to comfort him. "He looks like his father," Evelyn commented, observing the scene. "With Walter?" Tracy asked, surprised. "No, with the real father." Tracy froze, her face losing all color. How do you—" "I'm a neurologist, Miss Tracy. I work in the same hospital where you did your treatment." Evelyn put her glasses back. "Oh, Nish, and I have access to patient records." Ben's crying was the only sound in the room now. Tracy hugged him tighter, as if she could protect him from the truth that threatened to surface. "Walter doesn't know," she whispered. "No one knows." "But Richard needs to know," Evelyn insisted, "because Ben's father is connected to Megan's disappearance. And you know that, don't you?" Nam Doom, at St. Mark's School, oblivious to the conversation taking place at her home, Jane and Sarah were in the library during recess. The unlikely friendship between the two girls had blossomed after the episode in the nurse's office. "I don't understand. This equation, Sarah frowned at her math book. Jane leaned over her friend's notebook. It's easier if you think of it as a puzzle. Each number has its right place. Like you? Sarah asked suddenly. Have you found your right place here too? Jane was silent for a moment. I don't know. Sometimes it feels like I'm living someone else's life, as if your dad is trying to turn me into someone I'm not. Into Megan, Sarah completed softly. Jane looked up, surprised. Who is Megan? Before Sarah could answer, a commotion in the hallway caught their attention. Melissa Stone and her friends entered the library, whispering and laughing, holding their cell phones. You won't believe what I found out, Melissa announced loudly. Enough for Sarah and Jane to hear. About Sarah's father and her aunt who disappeared. Sarah's face paled. Jane took her hand under the table, feeling it tremble. My mom works at the courthouse, Melissa continued. She found some old documents. It seems the police suspected that... Enough! Deborah Peterson's firm voice cut through the air of the library. The social worker stood at the door, her eyes fixed on Melissa. Ms. Stone, come with me to the principal's office. Now. As Melissa and her friends were escorted out, Deborah gave a meaningful look to Jane. For a moment, something passed between them, a recognition, a mutual understanding that Jane couldn't explain. In Richard's office, the businessman was immersed in a pile of old documents, yellowed newspaper clippings, faded photos, police records he had obtained through contacts, all related to Megan's disappearance. His cell phone vibrated. Another. Message from the number he now knew belonged to Deborah. Your mother, Zuleika, still lives in the same house? Richard felt his heart skip a beat. His mother, at 75, lived reclusively in a country house on the outskirts of the city. She had never fully recovered from the loss of her daughter and the suicide of her husband a few years later. But why was Deborah asking about her? The phone on his desk rang. It was his secretary. Mr. Davenport, Dr. Evelyn is on the line. She says it's urgent. Something about Ms. Tracy Carter. Richard closed his eyes, feeling a headache coming on. So many secrets, so many connections that he still couldn't fully understand. His cell phone vibrated again. This time it was a photo. An old photo that he had never seen before, his sister Megan smiling at the camera, holding a newborn baby. The date in the corner of the photo, 3 months after her supposed disappearance. And in the background of the image, partially visible, was a woman he immediately recognized, the young Zuleika, his mother, 30 years younger. The truth began to unfold, piece by piece, and it was much more complex and painful than anyone could imagine. Zuleika Davenport spent her days in an almost monastic routine in the country house that had become her refuge. The cream-colored walls held dozens of family photos, all prior to that fateful night that changed everything. In one of them, particularly worn by time, Megan smiled, embraced by her older brother. The sound of tires on the gravel of the garden awakened her from her memories. Through the living room window, she saw Richard's car parking. It wasn't the day of his usual visit. "Mom?" His voice sounded tense when she opened the door. "We need to talk." Zuleika observed her son. So much. Like his father, the same intense eyes, the same rigid posture. But there was something different today, an urgency that frightened her. "It's about Megan," he continued, entering the room without waiting for an invitation. "And about this." He held out his cell phone, showing the photo he had received. Zuleika felt her legs falter. Where did you get this?" "So it's true," Richard whispered, his voice trembling. "You knew. All this time, you knew." At St. Mark's School, Sarah was having a particularly strong anxiety attack in the women's restroom. Jane held her hand, trying to calm her down. "Melissa said she's going to tell everyone," Sarah sobbed, "about what happened to Aunt Megan, about how Grandpa died, about..." "Hey!" Jane interrupted her gently. Remember what you told me about numbers? That they don't lie. That there's always a solution? This is different, Sarah sniffled. No, it's not, Jane insisted. It's just a more complicated problem, and you know what we do with complicated problems. Break them into smaller parts, Sarah replied automatically, her breathing beginning to normalize. Exactly. So what's the first part we need to solve? Before Sarah could answer, the restroom door opened. It was Deborah Peterson. Girls, she called softly, we need to talk. At the Carter house, Tracy faced Evelyn with a mixture of fear and defiance. How did you find out? She asked finally. Hospital records don't lie, Evelyn replied. The dates, the names, it's all there, including the name of Ben's father. Tracy hugged her son, who had fallen asleep in her lap. He was a doctor at the rehab clinic. He said he could help me, that he understood my pain because he had also lost someone to drugs. And you believed him? At first, yes, Tracy wiped away a tear, but then I started to notice strange things. The way he talked about a former patient, how he became obsessed with stories of broken families, and there was a photo of a girl who looked so much like Jane. At the country house, Zuleika finally broke the silence. Your sister was pregnant, she said, her voice barely a whisper. When she found out, she was terrified. Your father, he would have killed her, Richard, really killed her this time. Richard felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. What? That night when you found her after the beating, Zuleika continued, tears streaming down her wrinkled face. I already had a plan. I had already arranged everything. A safe place, a new identity. You faked her death? It was the only way to save her and the baby. Zuleika got up with difficulty, heading to an old trunk in the corner of the room. But there's more, son. Much more. In the school restroom, Deborah watched the two girls with a gentle expression that contrasted with her usual severity. Sarah, she began, what do you know about your Aunt Megan? Only what everyone says, Sarah replied, still trembling slightly. That she disappeared when she was 15, that Dad was the last to see her, that Grandpa killed himself because of it. Deborah nodded slowly. And you, Jane? What do you know about your family? Jane frowned. What do you mean? About your mother, for example, about where she's been for the last 3 years, about Ben. At the Carter house, Tracy continued her confession to Evelyn. The doctor, Dr. Robert, he started asking strange questions about Jane, about Walter. He wanted to know details about our lives, about our story. She hesitated. And then, one day, I found something in his office, an old newspaper clipping, about the disappearance of a teenager, Megan Davenport. Evelyn felt a shiver run down her spine. And what did you do? I ran. I took Ben and ran. Tracy hugged her son tighter. But before I saw something else, something that changed everything. At the country house, Zuleika removed an old metal box from the trunk. Inside were letters, photos, documents. Megan had a girl, she said, her voice trembling. A girl who was given up for adoption as soon as she was born, to protect her, to give her a chance at a normal life. Richard picked up one of the photos with trembling hands. It was a newborn, with big, expressive eyes. The girl was adopted by a couple, Zuleika continued, a construction worker and his wife. Their last name was Carter, Richard completed, his whole world collapsing around him. Jane is your niece, Zuleika confirmed, Megan's daughter. In the school restroom, Deborah took something out of her pocket, an old photo, identical to the one Richard had received. Sometimes, she said softly, families are much more complex than they seem. And sometimes circles need to close for the truth to come out. Sarah and Jane looked at the photo, their eyes widening in recognition. At the Carter house, Tracy revealed to Evelyn the last and most shocking secret. And at the country house, Zuleika finally told Richard the whole truth, a truth that connected all those lives in ways that no one could have imagined. Richard's cell phone vibrated once more. It was Deborah again. "It's time for everyone to meet. At the old Davenport house. Tonight, it's time for the truth to come out." Twilight painted the sky in orange hues as the cars began to arrive at the old Davenport house. The place, although inhabited by another family, was temporarily empty. Deborah had arranged everything in some way that no one fully understood. Richard was the first to arrive, his hands still trembling after the conversation with his mother. Zuleika was in the passenger seat, her face marked by decades of secrets and guilt. As they got out of the car, they saw Evelyn parking, right behind them, accompanied by Sarah. "Dad!" Sarah called out hesitantly, seeing Richard's devastated expression. Before he could answer, another car arrived. It was a taxi, bringing Tracy, Walter, and the children. Jane held little Ben's hand, her big eyes observing the house with a curiosity that now made painfully sense to Richard. The last car to arrive was Deborah's. She got out slowly, as if each movement was carefully calculated. In the passenger seat, a figure remained seated, only a silhouette visible through the tinted glass. "Everyone's here," Deborah announced, her voice carrying a weight that no one had heard before. "As it should be." "Who are you?" Richard asked, his voice hoarse. "Really?" Deborah smiled sadly. "I think you already know, brother." The word fell like a bomb in the silence of the night. Walter stepped forward, placing himself protectively in front of his family. "What are you talking about?" "Daddy!" Jane called out softly, her voice small but clear. "I think she's my mother. My first mother." Tracy sobbed, squeezing Ben against her chest. Sarah approached Jane, taking her hand. Cousins, they now knew, united by a blood tie that no one suspected. Not exactly, a new voice was heard. The door of Deborah's car opened, and the figure in the passenger seat finally emerged. It was a middle-aged woman, with the same big, expressive eyes as Jane, Megan Davenport, 30 years older but unmistakable. "I'm your mother, Jane," she said softly. "Deborah. Deborah is the one who helped me find you after all these years." Zuleika staggered, needing to lean on Richard. "Megan, my daughter, Mom," Megan replied, her voice trembling. "Brother." The group remained silent for long moments, the weight of the revelations hanging in the night air. It was Jane who finally broke the silence, her voice carrying a wisdom beyond her years. "Is that why Mr. Davenport always took care of me? Because we're family?" "Not exactly," Deborah interjected. "Richard didn't know. No one knew except Dr. Robert," Tracy completed, her voice barely a whisper. "The doctor at the rehab clinic. He found out somehow, didn't he?" Megan nodded slowly. "Robert is my husband, the man who helped me when I found out I was pregnant, who helped me start over after Mom sent me away." "But he went crazy," Deborah continued. "The obsession with reuniting the family, with correcting the mistakes of the past. He started stalking you, didn't he, Tracy?" Tracy confirmed with a nod, tears streaming down her face. "He found out about Jane, about the adoption. He started asking questions, putting pressure on me when I found out I was pregnant." "Ben," Walter murmured, painful understanding in his voice. "He's not my son." "He's mine." Robert emerged from the shadows of the garden, making everyone jump. "Mine and Tracy's. Just as Jane is my stepdaughter, daughter of the woman I've loved for 30 years. Richard stepped forward, placing himself between Robert and the group. "Did you plan all this, to make me find Jane that day?" "No," Deborah answered for him. "That was fate. Or maybe it was inevitable. The circles needed to close. But why? Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Why all this secrecy? Why so much suffering? Because sometimes, Megan replied softly, protecting those we love means keeping them away. I was young, pregnant, and terrified. Mom sent me away to protect me from Dad, but in the process, we created more pain, Zuleika completed, tears running down her wrinkled face. Forgive me, daughter. Forgive me, all of you. The silence that followed was deafening. Years of secrets, lies, and pain converged at that moment, in that garden where everything had begun 3 decades ago. And now, Jane asked, looking from Walter and Tracy to Megan, what happens now? The answer came in the form of a sharp cry. Ben had woken up, frightened by all the unfamiliar voices. Tracy rocked him automatically, but it was Megan who approached first. Now, she said softly, we start over, all of us, as a family. If you want, Robert added, addressing Walter. I know I have no right to ask for anything, but... Ben is my son, Walter interrupted him firmly. It doesn't matter the blood, just as Jane is my daughter, no matter who bore her. The words hung in the night air, laden with meaning. Richard watched the scene, his heart a confused mix of emotions. Beside him, Sarah squeezed his hand. Dad, she whispered, I think I understand now why you always tried to save everyone. Because that's what families do, Deborah completed, a small smile on her lips. Even when they don't know their family. But there was more to be revealed that night. Much more. And as the moon rose in the sky, illuminating the garden where so many stories intertwined, no one noticed the figure, watching them from the house next door, a figure carrying the last and most surprising secret of all. The moon was already high in the sky when the first raindrop fell, as if the sky itself wanted to wash away the sorrows of that newfound family. The group took shelter on the porch of the old Davenport house, the cramped space forcing them into a physical proximity that mirrored the emotional proximity that was beginning to form. We need to talk about Dr. Robert, Deborah said, breaking the charged silence, about what really happened at the rehab clinic. Tracy visibly shuddered, pulling Ben even closer to her chest. Walter, noticing her discomfort, took a step towards her, but stopped when he saw Robert make the same movement. I wasn't crazy, Robert spoke, his voice trembling slightly. Everything I did was for love, for family. Love? Megan turned to him, her eyes shining with contained tears. You stalked a vulnerable woman, Robert. You used your position as a doctor to manipulate her. I just wanted to bring our daughter back, he protested. When I found out that Jane was... She's not your daughter, Walter interrupted him, his voice laden with a contained anger. I raised her, I loved her, even when I failed her. Jane, who was sitting between Sarah and Ben, raised her head at these words. Her big eyes, Megan's eyes, everyone could now see, moved from one adult to another, absorbing every word, every emotion. No one is taking Jane away from you, Megan assured them gently. That's not what I want. Then what do you want? Richard's voice sounded hoarse, laden with decades of guilt and longing. Before Megan could answer, a movement in the neighboring house caught everyone's attention. An elderly woman was standing at the window, watching the group with an expression that mixed recognition and shock. Mrs. Johnson, Zuleika whispered, her face paling even further. She still lives here? Who's Mrs. Johnson? Sarah asked, noticing how all the adults had suddenly become tense. The only person besides me who knew the whole truth, Zuleika replied, her voice barely a whisper. The person who helped Megan. That night, the rain increased, the sound of the drops on the roof creating a sonic curtain that seemed to isolate that moment from the rest of the world. Mrs. Johnson had disappeared from the window, But seconds later, the door of her house opened. "I knew that one day you would come back," the lady said, her voice surprisingly firm for someone her age. "All of you." "Including me," a new voice was heard, making everyone turn around. At the end of the porch, partially hidden by the shadows, was a woman that no one had noticed until then. When she stepped forward, Zuleika let out a gasp of recognition. "Mary," she whispered, "my sister." The shock of the revelation ran through the group like a wave. Mary Davenport, Zuleika's sister, who everyone believed had died decades ago, was alive and there before them. "Aunt Mary?" Richard stepped forward, incredulous. "But how?" "I helped your mother hide Megan," Mary explained, her voice soft but firm. "And then, when your father started asking questions, when he started to suspect, Zuleika asked me to disappear too, to protect the secret." "It was you." Megan took a deep breath, understanding. "It was you who arranged Jane's adoption papers." Mary nodded slowly. "And it was through me that Robert discovered the truth. He was my doctor at the clinic where I volunteered. One day, he recognized me from an old photo at Megan's house." The revelation hung in the air like the rain itself, heavy and inevitable. Each piece of the puzzle began to fall into place, forming an image that was both painful and liberating. "But there's still more," Mrs. Johnson interjected, her voice carrying the weight of decades of secrets. "Much more." All eyes turned to her, waiting. The elderly lady took a yellowed envelope from her coat pocket. "Your father gave me this before he died," she said, extending the envelope to Zuleika. "He made me promise only to deliver it when everyone was gathered again." With trembling hands, Zuleika opened the envelope. Inside was a letter and an antique key. The key to the cellar, she recognized, her voice failing. "Where your father kept his deepest secrets," Mrs. Johnson completed, "including the real reason he was so violent with Megan." The rain seemed to increase even more, as if trying to stifle the revelations that were to come. Jane drew closer to Walter and Tracy, instinctively seeking the comfort of the parents who raised her, while Ben slept peacefully in his mother's arms, oblivious to the weight of the story unfolding around him. "I think it's time," Deborah said softly, "to know the whole truth, not just about Megan and Jane, but about all the generations of the Davenports." The antique key gleamed under the dim light of the porch, promising more revelations, more secrets, more pain, but also, perhaps, ultimate liberation. The cellar of the old Davenport house remained exactly as it had been 30 years ago, exposed brick walls, a musty smell, and a darkness that seemed to swallow the light from the flashlights that Mrs. Johnson had provided. The key turned in the lock with a metallic creak that made everyone shudder. "Are you sure we should do this?" Richard asked, his voice echoing in the confined space. "Some things maybe should remain buried." "No," Megan replied firmly. "We've lived with half-truths for too long." The group descended the stairs in single file, the old wood protesting under their feet. Only the children remained upstairs, Ben sleeping on an improvised couch, Jane and Sarah huddled in a corner of the living room, watching apprehensively as the adults disappeared into the darkness. In the cellar, Mary went straight to a dusty bookshelf in the farthest corner. Her hands, wrinkled with age but firm, removed several books, revealing a small metal door in the wall. "The safe," Zuleika whispered. "Dad never let anyone get close." "Except me," Mrs. Johnson approached, her eyes shining with contained tears. "I was the only one he trusted in the end." With trembling fingers, the elderly woman entered a combination on the small numeric keypad. The safe door opened with a soft click, revealing its contents, a carved wooden box, yellowed with age. "Before we open it," Mrs. Johnson said, her voice laden with weight, "you need to understand something. Your father, August Davenport, wasn't a naturally violent man. He carried a weight, a guilt that consumed him from within until it turned him into the monster you knew." "What weight?" Tracy asked softly, giving voice to the question everyone wanted to ask. Mrs. Johnson picked up the box with reverential care. "The story begins with his mother, your grandmother, Margaret Davenport. She also had a secret, one that ended up repeating through the generations." "How so?" Richard frowned. "Open the box," Mrs. Johnson instructed. "But be prepared. When there will change everything you thought you knew about your family." Zuleika, with trembling hands, opened the box. Inside were old photos, yellowed letters, and a small black notebook. But it was a newspaper clipping that immediately caught everyone's attention. "Tragedy in the Davenport family," Megan read aloud. "Young mother commits suicide after shocking discovery." The date on the newspaper was 1945. "Your grandmother didn't kill herself," Mrs. Johnson said softly. "She was killed by her own husband, August's father, when he discovered the truth about his son." "What truth?" Walter asked, his voice barely a whisper. "August wasn't Margaret's husband's son," Mary replied, taking one of the letters from the box. "He was the result of a relationship she had with another man. A man of humble origins, a construction worker." The silence that followed was deafening. Zuleika brought her hands to her mouth, understanding the implications. "That's why Dad was so obsessive with social status," Mrs. Johnson completed. "With appearances?" "Yes. He discovered the truth about his origins when he was 15, the same time that Megan became pregnant. History was repeating itself in his distorted mind." "But there's more," Robert spoke for the first time since they entered the cellar. "Isn't there, Mrs. Johnson? It has to do with the last name Carter." The elderly woman nodded slowly. "The man with whom Margaret was involved, his last name was Carter, Anthony Carter." The shock of the revelation hit everyone like a wave. Walter staggered, needing to lean on the wall. "You're saying that—" "Yes," Mrs. Johnson confirmed. "Walter Carter is a direct descendant of Anthony Carter. The blood of the Davenports and the Carters was already mixed long before Jane was born." "That's why Dr. Robert became so obsessed when he found out," Tracy murmured, understanding. "It wasn't just about Jane. It was about completing a circle that started 3 generations ago. And that's why your father was so violent with Megan," Mary added, looking at Zuleika. "When he found out she was pregnant, all his traumas, all his insecurities about his own origins came to the surface." Richard leaned against the cellar wall, feeling the weight of decades of secrets and lies. "So, all this time, all these destroyed lives, because of prejudice," Megan completed, her voice laden with an ancient anger, "because of wounded pride and social appearances. But there's still more," Mrs. Johnson said, withdrawing a last envelope from the box. "Something that not even Robert knows. Something about his own history, Doctor." Robert looked up, surprised. "How so?" "Your mother," the elderly woman began, "also had a connection with the Davenports, a connection that she took to the grave, but that is documented here." The rain outside had increased, as if the sky itself wanted to stifle the revelations that were to come. Upstairs, Jane and Sarah hugged each other tighter, as they heard a distant clap of thunder. Fate, it seemed, had woven a web much more complex than anyone could imagine, and there were still more truths to be revealed, more secrets to be exposed to the light. The last envelope in Mrs. Johnson's hand promised the final revelation, the one that would forever change everyone's understanding of love, family, and forgiveness. The last envelope that Mrs. Johnson held seemed to weigh a ton in her wrinkled hands. The rain continued to fall relentlessly outside, creating an even denser atmosphere in the already emotionally charged cellar. "Before opening this envelope," the elderly woman began, her voice trembling slightly, "you need to understand something about Dr. Robert's mother. Amelia Peterson wasn't just an ordinary nurse at the hospital where she worked for 30 years. Deborah stepped forward, her eyes fixed on the envelope. "Peterson? But that's your last name," Mrs. Johnson confirmed. "It's not a coincidence." "Deborah, Amelia was your aunt." The shock of the revelation ran through the group like an electric current. Robert staggered, needing to lean against a nearby shelf. "Impossible," he murmured. "My mother never mentioned—" "Because she was protecting an even bigger secret," Mrs. Johnson continued. "A secret that involved not only the Davenports and the Carters, but also the Petersons." With trembling fingers, the elderly woman opened the envelope. From inside, it fell an old black-and-white photo. It showed a young nurse, Amelia, next to a patient in a hospital bed. The patient was Margaret Davenport. "Your mother, Dr. Robert, was the nurse who helped Margaret Davenport in her last moments," Mrs. Johnson explained. "It was to her that Margaret told the whole truth about August, about the Carters, and it was she who promised to protect that secret, passing it through the generations of her own family." "That's why you became a social worker," Megan whispered, looking at Deborah. "It wasn't by chance that you were involved in Jane's case from the beginning." Deborah nodded slowly. "Aunt Amelia told me everything on her deathbed. She made me promise that I would help fix what had been broken so many years ago. But there's more," Mrs. Johnson added, taking more documents from the envelope. "Amelia didn't just guard the secret. She also protected something much more valuable." "What?" Tracy asked, her voice barely a whisper. "The true legacy of the Davenports," the elderly woman replied. "Not the money or the properties, but something much more precious. Proof that August Davenport wasn't the monster everyone thought." From inside the envelope, she withdrew a letter yellowed by time. The handwriting was firm, masculine. "This letter was written by August on the night he took his own life," Mrs. Johnson explained softly. "It was addressed to Megan." Megan stepped forward, her hands trembling as she took the letter. She began to read aloud. "My dearest daughter, when you read this, I will no longer be here. The weight of my mistakes, of my cowardice, has finally overcome me. But before I leave, I need you to know the truth. That night when I found out about your pregnancy, it wasn't anger I felt, it was fear. A terrible, paralyzing fear that history was repeating itself, that you would be judged and condemned as my mother. Was that your child would carry the same burden that I carried. My violence didn't stem from hatred, but from despair. Each blow I gave you was like a blow to myself, to the frightened child who discovered his true origin and didn't know how to deal with it. I know that words can't erase what I did, that apologies don't heal scars, but I want you to know that, despite everything, I loved you. I loved you and your brother more than my own life, and that's why I'm leaving, because I know that as long as I'm here, you will never be truly free. You will never be able to break the cycle of pain that began so long ago. Take care of your baby, my daughter. Give him or her the love that I didn't know how to give, and maybe, one day, when it's time, tell the truth about our family, not as a story of shame and secrets, but as a story of redemption, with love, even. If you don't believe it, your father." The silence that followed the reading was heavy as lead. Tears ran freely down Megan's face, staining the old paper. "Why," she choked, "why didn't anyone show me this before?" "Because I didn't let them," Zuleika admitted, her voice broken. "Because at that time I was also trapped in the same prejudices, in the same fears. Only now can I see how wrong we all were." Upstairs, a particularly loud clap of thunder made Jane jump. Sarah hugged her tighter, the two girls united not only by blood, but by a deep understanding of the weight that their families carried. "And now," Walter asked, his voice hoarse, "what do we do with all this truth?" The answer came from where they least expected. Tracy, who had remained silent for so long, stepped forward. "Now," she said firmly, "we break the cycle. For real." But even as she spoke, no one noticed that there was another person listening, someone who was watching everything through a small crack in the cellar door, someone whose own history was about to add yet another layer to this complex tapestry of secrets and revelations. The sound of footsteps descending the cellar stairs made everyone turn around. In the dim light, a familiar figure emerged from the shadows. Melissa Stone, the teenager who had so tormented Sarah at school, was standing on the last step, her face pale and stained with tears. "Melissa?" Sarah took a step forward, confused. Why are you here?" The girl was visibly trembling, her eyes fixed on Mrs. Johnson. The elderly woman let out a heavy sigh, as if she had been waiting for this moment. "She's here," Mrs. Johnson said softly, "because she's also part of this story." "How so?" Richard asked, his voice tense. "Because," Melissa responded, her voice barely a whisper, "Amelia Peterson was my grandmother too." The shock of the revelation ran through the group like a wave. Robert took a step towards the girl, his eyes wide with recognition. You're Clara's daughter." Melissa nodded, tears streaming silently down her face. "My mother died last year. Before she passed, she told me everything, about Grandma Amelia, about the Davenports, about you, Uncle Robert." "Uncle?" Tracy asked, her voice trembling. "Clara was my younger sister," Robert explained, his voice choked with emotion. "She distanced herself from the family when our parents died. I didn't know she had a daughter. She made me promise that I would find you," Melissa continued, "that I would help fix what was broken. That's why I started provoking Sarah at school, spreading rumors about Megan. I thought that if I created enough confusion, the truth would come out. That's why you had access to the courthouse documents," Deborah understood. "It wasn't your mother who worked there. It was you looking for information." "I'm sorry," Melissa said to Sarah, sobbing. "I'm sorry for everything. I just wanted to be part of the family too." Sarah, surprising everyone, including herself, crossed the cellar and hugged Melissa. The two teenagers cried together, years of antagonism dissolving in the mutual understanding of their pain. "There's one more thing," Melissa said, wiping away her tears. "Something I found among my mother's belongings. Something about Ben." Tracy hugged the sleeping child tighter. "What about him?" "The DNA test." Melissa pulled a crumpled envelope from her pocket. "The one that proves that Dr. Robert isn't the real father." The silence that followed was deafening. Robert staggered, needing to lean on the wall. "How so?" he whispered. "But you said—" "I lied," Tracy admitted, her voice broken. "I lied because I was scared, because you were obsessive, dangerous, because Ben's real father," Deborah completed softly, "is Walter." Walter, who had remained silent, looked up with tear-filled eyes. "You knew?" "Always knew," Tracy replied, crying. "Even during those 3 years away, even with all the fear and confusion, I always knew that Ben was your son. Our son." Robert let out a bitter laugh. "So everything was for nothing? All this obsession, all this manipulation?" "Not for nothing," Megan interjected, approaching him. "You brought us together, Robert, in a distorted way, yes, but you brought us all here. You made us face the truth. And now," Mary asked, her voice gentle, "what do we do with all those truths?" It was Jane who answered, descending the cellar stairs with determined steps. Everyone turned to her, surprised by her presence. "Now," the girl said with a wisdom beyond her years, "we stop lying, we stop hiding, we stop hurting each other." She walked to the center of the group, taking Walter's hand with one of hers and Megan's hand with the other. "You're my parents," she said to Walter and Tracy. "The ones who raised me, the ones who loved me even when it was hard." Then she turned to Megan. "And you're my mom too, the one who gave me life, the one who suffered to protect me." Her words, simple but profound, seemed to break something in the atmosphere. One by one, the adults began to cry, not tears of pain or regret, but of liberation. "She's right," Sarah said, still embraced by Melissa. "No more secrets, no more fear." The rain outside had lessened, as if the sky itself recognized the importance of that moment of healing. But there was still one last revelation to be made, one that Mrs. Johnson held in her heart, waiting for the right moment to share. And that moment was coming. The elderly woman took one last piece of paper from inside her purse, her hands trembling slightly. It was a photograph, older than all the others, showing a young woman with a baby in her arms. "There's one more thing you need to know," she began, "about who I really am." The photograph that Mrs. Johnson held was yellowed at the edges, marked by time, but the image was still clear. A young woman, no more than 20 years old, with big, expressive eyes, the same eyes that everyone now recognized in Jane, holding a newborn baby. "This is me," Mrs. Johnson said softly, "with Margaret Davenport in my arms." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the rain outside seemed to have stopped to listen. You're... Zuleika couldn't complete the sentence. "Yes," Mrs. Johnson confirmed. "I'm Margaret's real mother, the woman everyone knew, as her mother was, in fact, her aunt, my oldest sister." Robert approached the photograph, his eyes studying every detail. "But why? Why didn't you ever tell us?" "Because it was 1925, Mrs. Johnson replied, her voice laden with old memories. "I was young, single, from a traditional family. When I got pregnant, well, back then, there was only one solution. Give the baby to my sister to raise as her own." "And the father?" Megan asked gently. "A good man," Mrs. Johnson smiled sadly. "A math teacher. He died before Margaret was born, in a train accident. Maybe that's where Jane's talent with numbers comes from." The girl, who was embraced by Walter, looked up with interest. "You're my great-great-grandmother?" "I am," Mrs. Johnson confirmed, tears streaming down her wrinkled face. "And I've spent all these years watching, protecting our family as best I could, even when I couldn't interfere directly." "You always knew," Richard realized, "about everything, about all of us." "Yes," she nodded. "I saw Margaret grow up, fall in love with the wrong man, have August. I saw how my granddaughter suffered, how my great-grandson became a bitter man. I saw Megan run away. I saw Jane born. I saw all the circles closing, one generation after another." "That's why you never moved from this house," Mary understood. "Always stayed here right next door, keeping all the secrets," Tracy completed, "protecting all of us." "But now," Mrs. Johnson said, her voice gaining strength, "it's time to stop protecting secrets. It's time to protect the truth." She turned to Robert, her eyes gentle but firm. "It's time for you to let go, my son. Your obsession with this family, it comes from a place of pain, I know, but it's time to heal that pain." Robert covered his face with his hands, sobbing. Megan, after a moment of hesitation, placed a hand on his shoulder. "We all need to heal," she said softly. "What about me?" Melissa asked, her voice small. "What's my place in all this?" "Your place is here," Sarah replied before anyone could speak. "With us, with your family." The two teenagers exchanged a hesitant smile. years of rivalry transforming into mutual understanding. "There's one more thing," Mrs. Johnson said, withdrawing one last object from her purse. It was a small music box, old but well preserved. This belonged to Margaret. She used to play it for August to sleep when he was little. With hands trembling slightly, she turned the key. A soft melody filled the cellar. The same melody that Megan, without knowing why, used to hum to Jane when she was a baby. "Some and things," the elderly woman said softly, "pass from generation to generation without us realizing it. Love is one of them, the ability to forgive is another." Ben chose this moment to wake up, his soft crying echoing in the space. Tracy rocked him gently and for the first time allowed Walter to approach and touch the child's face. "They're true, son. And now," Walter asked, his voice hoarse with emotion, "how do we move forward with all this?" "Together," Jane answered simply. "As a family, a big, complicated and a little messy family, but a family." At that moment, as if the sky itself wanted to give its blessing, the rain stopped completely. Through the small cellar window, a ray of sunlight managed to penetrate, illuminating the gathered group. But even in that moment of apparent resolution, Mrs. Johnson knew that there was still one last truth to be revealed. A truth that she had kept for over 70 years, waiting for the right moment to share. Her eyes turned to the still-playing music box and to the small secret compartment in its base that no one, not even Margaret, had ever discovered. It was time. Time to reveal the last secret of the Davenports. With fingers trembling with age, but still surprisingly agile, Mrs. Johnson turned the music box over, revealing its time-worn base. The melody continued to play softly as she pressed a specific point on the old wood. A soft click echoed through the cellar, and a small secret compartment opened. "I've never shown this to anyone," she said, her voice laden with emotion. "Not even to Margaret. It was my last gift to her, to be delivered only when everything made sense." From inside the compartment, she withdrew an envelope sealed with red wax. The seal showed a symbol that made Zuleika gasp. The coat of arms of the math teacher's family, Margaret's real father. "The Almeidas," Zuleika whispered, "one of the oldest families in the city." "Yes," Mrs. Johnson confirmed, "and owners of a fortune that Fernando Almeida, my great love and Margaret's father, left in his will to his unrecognized daughter." "A fortune?" Richard frowned. "But Margaret lived her whole life." "In modest conditions, yes," Mrs. Johnson completed, "because she never knew about that will. My sister, who raised her as a daughter, hid the truth from her, hid it from everyone." With reverential care, she opened the envelope. Inside were documents yellowed by time, the original will of Fernando Almeida, recognizing Margaret as his daughter and sole heir. "But that means," Robert began, his voice failing, "it means that all of August's suffering about his humble origins was based on a lie," Megan completed, understanding. "He was, in fact, the grandson of one of the most traditional families in the city." "And there's more," Mrs. Johnson continued, withdrawing more papers from the envelope. "Fernando didn't just leave money. He left letters, dozens of them, that he wrote to Margaret during my pregnancy. Letters that were never delivered." Jane approached, curious, as the elderly woman began to read one of the letters. "My dearest daughter, even without knowing you, I already love you more than I could explain. Your mathematical heart, I'm sure, will understand that some problems have no simple solution, that sometimes we need to accept the variables of life as they are, not as we would like them to be. I leave for you not only my fortune, but my greatest treasure, the love of knowledge, for the pursuit of truth through numbers. Your mother tells me that she already feels you stirring in her belly when we talk about equations." Mrs. Johnson's voice faltered, tears streaming down her wrinkled face. "Jane's gift with numbers," Tracy murmured. "It's no coincidence." "No," the elderly woman confirmed, "just as it's no coincidence that Sarah has the same social anxiety that Fernando had, or that Melissa has his blue eyes, so characteristic of the Almeidas." "But why reveal this now?" Walter asked. "Why not before?" "Because," Mrs. Johnson replied, "money was never the important thing. The important thing was the truth about love, about family, about forgiveness." She paused, looking at each face around her. "And you needed to be ready for that truth." "And the fortune?" Robert asked. "After so much time." "It's intact," Mrs. Johnson smiled softly. "Growing in accounts and investments that Fernando left. Established, waiting for the right moment. But it doesn't matter anymore, does it?" Jane said suddenly, surprising everyone. "The money, I mean. It's not what makes us family." Sarah and Melissa approached her, each taking one of her hands. 3 generations of the same heritage, united not by blood or money, but by love and understanding. "The girl is right," Mary smiled. "The real treasure is here, in this cellar, in the truth that has freed us." Richard looked at his sister Megan, then at Jane, his niece whom fate had placed in his path so unexpectedly. "Family is much more than blood or inheritance. It's choice," Tracy completed, looking at Walter and Ben. "It's forgiveness. It's love," Robert admitted finally, dropping his last mask of obsession and bitterness. The music box continued to play its soft melody, cradling that moment of understanding and healing. But Mrs. Johnson knew that there was still one last revelation to be made, one that would change not only the future of the family, but also its past. With hands trembling slightly, she withdrew one last paper from the envelope, a document that would prove that fate had woven its web with much more care than anyone could imagine. "There's one more thing you need to know," she said softly, "about the real reason why our lives intertwined this way." The last document that Mrs. Johnson held was different from the others. It wasn't a paper yellowed by time, but rather a more recent sheet, folded carefully. "Before I show this," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "I need to tell you something about Fernando, Margaret's father, something that not even I knew until a few years ago." Everyone approached instinctively, forming a closer circle around the elderly woman. The music box continued its soft melody, like a soundtrack to that crucial moment. "Fernando didn't die in that train accident," she revealed, making everyone hold their breath. "He faked his own death." "How?" Zuleika asked, shocked. "He discovered that he was sick, very sick, and he knew that his family would never accept an illegitimate daughter," Mrs. Johnson continued. "So he planned everything, the accident, the will, the investments. He moved to the countryside under another name, where he lived for another 30 years. "But how did you find out?" Richard questioned. "Because," Mrs. Johnson unfolded the paper she held, "he never stopped watching us. From afar, protected by his new identity, he followed every moment of Margaret's life, every joy, every sorrow." The paper was a letter dated just 5 years ago. The handwriting, although shaky with age, was unmistakably the same as the old letters. "This was the last letter he wrote shortly before he really died," Mrs. Johnson explained. "It was sent to me through a lawyer, with instructions to only be opened when our family was ready for the truth." She began to read, her voice choked with emotion. "My dearest Josephine, if you are reading this, it means that the moment I predicted so many years ago has finally arrived. The moment when all the circles would close, when all the pains could be healed. I watched from afar when our Margaret suffered, when August was lost in his own bitterness, when Megan needed to flee. I saw when Jane was born, carrying in her eyes the same light that I saw in you so many years ago. But what no one knows, what I kept as my last secret, is that I didn't just watch. Over the years, under different names and through different means, I helped weave the net that would keep our family together, even when it seemed to be falling apart. It was through one of my companies that Robert got his first job as a doctor. It was through my indirect influence that Deborah became a social worker. It was my money, through anonymous foundations, that helped Tracy get treatment. I didn't do it out of guilt or obligation, but out of love. The same love that I felt for you, Josephine, from the first moment. The same love that I could never openly demonstrate to our daughter. But now, my last act of love needs to be revealed. Mrs. Johnson paused, looking directly at Walter. Anthony Carter, your grandfather Walter, was my younger brother. The revelation fell like a bomb in the silent cellar. Walter staggered, needing to lean on the wall. So, he stammered. So the blood of the Almeidas was already running in the veins of the Carters long before Jane. Megan understood, her eyes widening. It wasn't a coincidence at all. Destiny, Mary whispered, or maybe something much deeper than that. Fernando knew, Mrs. Johnson continued. He knew that one day the families would reunite, that the circle would close in the most perfect way possible. That's why I always felt so connected to this family, Jane said softly. It wasn't just because I'm Megan's daughter, it was much more. Much more, Mrs. Johnson confirmed, and there's still one last thing you need to see. With trembling hands, she turned the music box over once more. There was another secret compartment, even smaller than the first. From inside it, she withdrew an antique key. This key, she said, opens a door in the attic of this house. A door that holds Fernando's last gift for all of us. The music box finally stopped its melody, leaving the cellar in a silence laden with anticipation. Outside, the sun began to set, painting the sky with golden hues that entered through the small window. It was time to go up to the attic and discover the last secret of the Davenports, a secret that promised not only to complete the circle, but to transform it into something entirely new. The staircase leading to the attic creaked under the feet of the group as they climbed in single file, guided by Mrs. Johnson. The air was thick with dust and expectation. Through the cracks in the roof, the last rays of the setting sun created beams of golden light that danced in the still air. Jane held Sarah and Melissa's hands firmly, the three girls united not only by their newfound blood tie, but by a deep understanding of the moment they were living. Ben slept peacefully in Tracy's arms, who walked beside Walter, their shoulders touching slightly, a couple reunited after so much suffering. When they reached the top of the stairs, everyone held their breath. There, in the farthest corner of the attic, was a door that seemed not to belong to the place, a door of solid oak, well preserved despite the years, with delicate carvings on its surface. This door, Mrs. Johnson said, her voice trembling slightly, was installed by Fernando weeks before his supposed accident. No one ever knew what was behind it, because the key he entrusted only to me. With hands wrinkled by time but firm in their purpose, she inserted the antique key into the lock. The mechanism turned smoothly, as if it had been lubricated recently. The door opened without a sound, revealing a room that made everyone gasp in surprise. It wasn't just a room, it was a library. Bookshelves from floor to ceiling covered all the walls, filled with books old and new. In the center of the room, a large, dark wood table supported a modern projector connected to a laptop. "How?" Richard began, but couldn't finish the question. "Fernando never stopped taking care of this place," Mrs. Johnson explained, entering the room. "Through the years, through different people, he kept this library updated, prepared." "Prepared for what?" Megan asked softly. In response, Mrs. Johnson turned on the projector. On the opposite wall, an image formed. It was a photograph of the whole family, taken just a few weeks ago, during Jane's first day at St. Mark's School. How did he get that? Robert whispered, shocked. He didn't. A new voice answered from the door. Everyone turned around. There, leaning on a cane, but with her eyes shining with intelligence, was a lady who must have been over 90 years old. Her face, marked by time, still retained traces of a classic beauty. Amanda, Mrs. Johnson breathed, barely believing her eyes. Amanda Almeida. Hello, Josephine, the lady smiled. Or should I say, sister-in-law. Amanda is Fernando's younger sister, Mrs. Johnson explained to the astonished group. The only one who always knew the truth, who always helped us in secret. And the person who kept this library alive all these years, Amanda completed, limping, into the room. Fulfilling my brother's last wish. She approached Jane, her eyes studying the girl's face with intensity. You have his eyes, the same eyes that saw mathematical patterns in everything. You know me? Jane asked timidly. I know all of you, Amanda smiled. I've been watching, protecting, guiding, always behind the scenes, always respecting the time that each revelation needed to happen. She turned to the group. This library isn't just a storehouse of books. It's a living testament to our family history. Each book, each document, each photograph tells a part of our journey. With a click on the laptop, she changed the projected image. Now it showed a series of documents, birth certificates, marriage records, family trees. See, she pointed, the Davenports, the Carters, the Almeidas, the Petersons, all these families, apparently separated by time and circumstance, have always been connected. They've always been one. How so? Melissa asked, stepping forward. Amanda smiled again, clicking on another image. It was an old photograph showing a group of children in front of a school. This photo was taken in 1930, she explained. Here's Fernando. She pointed to a boy with bright eyes. And here, his best friend at the time, Sophia Peterson, your grandmother Deborah. Deborah gasped, recognizing the girl in the photo. And here, Amanda continued, pointing to another boy, is Anthony Carter, still a child. They all studied together, grew up together. Their lives have always been intertwined, even when they didn't know it. She paused, looking at each face. In the room. Fernando knew that one day we would need this place, a place where all the truths could be revealed, where all the secrets could be finally freed. But there was one more revelation to be made. Amanda limped to a specific bookshelf and withdrew a thick book bound in red leather. This, she said, is the real treasure that my brother left for you. It's not money, it's not properties, it's something much more valuable. She opened the book, revealing pages and pages of handwritten notes. It's the complete history of our families. Not the version that the world knows, but the truth, with all its pains, joys, mistakes, and redemptions. And on the last page, she stopped, her eyes filling with tears. On the last page is Fernando's true will. A will that will change not only the future of our family, but also its past. With trembling hands, Amanda turned the last page of the book, bound in red leather. The light of the setting sun entered through the cracks in the attic, illuminating the words written in Fernando's elegant handwriting. To my beloved descendants, if you are reading these words, it means that the moment I predicted so many decades ago has finally arrived. The moment when all the masks would fall, when all the walls built by pride and fear would finally crumble. The real treasure I leave for you is not in bank accounts or properties, although they exist and are available to the family. The real treasure is the understanding that love, in all its complex and imperfect forms, is the only inheritance that really matters. To Jane, my great-great-granddaughter, who carries the gift of numbers as I carried, I leave my complete mathematical library and a perpetual scholarship in her name at MIT. For Sarah and Melissa, who have learned in the hardest way that blood Ties are less important than heart ties. I leave the task of keeping alive the story of our family, telling it to the next generations without fear or shame. For Tracy and Walter, who found their way back to each other through so many trials, I leave the house where I grew up so that they can raise Ben and Jane in a place full of love and happy memories. For Robert, who got lost trying to fix what he believed to be broken, I leave my forgiveness and understanding, along with the suggestion to use his medical talents to help other families heal. For Megan, who had the courage that I didn't have to face the world for love of her daughter, I leave the management of the Almeida Foundation, which from now on will be dedicated to helping single mothers and children in vulnerable situations. For Richard, who carried for so long the weight of a guilt that wasn't his, I leave the certainty that his heart was always in the right place, even when his actions seemed misguided. For Deborah, silent guardian of so many secrets, I leave the mission to continue her work of protecting families, now with all the necessary resources at her disposal. And for you, my beloved Josephine, who kept our love in your heart for so many decades, I leave these last words. You were the great love of my life, the mother of my only daughter, and the reason why I never lost faith in the ability of love to transcend all barriers. But my last and most important legacy is this. From today, the Almeida name will no longer be just a symbol of status and power. The family fortune will be transformed into a foundation dedicated to uniting separated families, to healing old wounds, to giving second chances to those who, like us, need help to find their way back home. And this library, this sanctuary that Amanda has kept alive for so many years, will be transformed into a center of memory and healing, where other families can learn that there are no irreparable mistakes when there is true love. I ask forgiveness for my cowardice in life, for not facing the prejudices of the time, for not publicly assuming my love for Josephine and my paternity of Margaret. But I hope that through this last act, through this last will, I can finally make the difference I always wanted to make. With eternal love, Fernando Almeida. When Amanda finished reading, there wasn't a single dry eye in the attic. Jane was the first to move, embracing first Walter and Tracy, then Megan, then each of those present, as if she wanted to physically demonstrate that everyone there was really one family. And now, Sarah asked, her voice choked with emotion, "What do we do?" It was Melissa who answered, surprising everyone. "Now we live. We live and love and forgive, as he wanted. And we keep the story alive," Jane completed, "so that no one else needs to carry secrets that are too heavy." One by one, everyone began to descend from the attic, carrying with them not only the weight of the revelations, but also the lightness that comes with the truth finally revealed. In the garden of the house, where it had all begun so many decades ago, Ben was playing on the grass, oblivious to the historical importance of that moment. Tracy and Walter watched him holding hands, while Megan and Richard talked softly under the shade of an old tree. Robert approached Deborah, extending his hand in a gesture of peace. "Can we work together at the foundation? Help other families?" "Of course," she smiled. "There's always room for healing." Sarah and Melissa sat down with Jane between them, already planning how they would document the history of the family for future generations. And in the center of it all, Mrs. Johnson and Amanda watched the scene with tears of joy in their eyes. "He did it," Amanda whispered. "Fernando finally managed to unite everyone." "No," Mrs. Johnson corrected softly. "We did it. All of us." The sun set on the horizon, painting the sky with colors that seemed to celebrate that moment of redemption and rebirth. The old Davenport house, which for so long had held secrets and pains, was now filled with laughter and promises of a better future. And somewhere, Fernando Almeida could finally rest in peace, knowing that his last and greatest wish had been fulfilled. His family was finally united, healed, and ready to write a new chapter in its history. The real treasure, after all, was never hidden in safes or bank accounts. It was there, alive and pulsating, in the smiles, in the tears, in the embraces and, above all, in the love that transcended generations, to finally bring peace to the hearts of the Davenports, the Carters, the Almeidas, and the Petersons, a family that, in the end, had always been one.